Graphical representation has been long entwined with the oral experience of music. Even if you don't know how to read music, you know what a note looks like. We even use scattering of note heads to represent the physical manifestation of music in video games and pictures. This is all well and good, but how did we get here? How did the seemingly arbitrary language of written music evolve? How did we get from this to this? Well, this week we are going to talk about the history of musical notation. In ancient times, music was transmitted orally from musician to musician. Hundreds of melodies would be memorized by trained professionals in secular or sacred circumstances. However, some ancient cultures had ways of reminding the musician how the melody went by creating dynamic squiggles over the printed text. Several texts from ancient Greece still survive with this method of notating music, including the Squiggles epitaph, the oldest musical manuscript to be fully preserved. It is dated from the 1st or 2nd century AD. It was engraved on a tombstone or a stela and found near modern-day Aden, Turkey. The story of Western musical notation continues in the church, where a system of neumes was developed to unify the chants being heard in churches throughout Europe. The earliest neumes were inflection marks over text used as a memory aid to the singers performing the chant. They did not specify pitches or rhythms, but instead demonstrated the motion of the chant. Called chiaroramic or campo aperto, there is evidence that they began to be used in the year 800 in the French city of Metz. This came directly from Charlemagne's desire for the Frankish singers to use the same chant inflections as the singers in Rome. The next breakthrough with neumes came from the 11th century from the churches of Benvenuto in southern Italy. These heightened or disymatic neumes used the space over the text to show relative pitches between neumes. A few manuscripts from the same period used diagraphic notation in which the note names are included below the neumes. Shortly after this, a 1-line to 4-line staff arrangement began to be used, usually attributed to Guido d'Arezzo of solfege fame. This clarified the exact relationship between the pitches. One line of the set usually had a rudimentary clef associated with it, telling the musician what note it was. The clef was a stylized letter, usually C, F, or G. In time, they became more and more stylized and developed into the clefs we use today. Chant, a method of reading scripture to hundreds of people, did not have any rhythmic notation. The rhythm of the chant was dictated by the text being recited, following the syllables and speech inflection. There were some points where it was melismatic or had more than one note to a syllable, but for the most part, it was all syllabic singing. The idea of notating rhythm came from secular and non-chant liturgical music around the same time. The tradition of polyphonic singing, or having more than one person sing at the same time, evolved next to chant. These motets, where multiple people sang together, were the first instances of composers using mensural notation. First used in the 13th century, mensural notation was based on ancient rhythmic modes, or set patterns of long and short durations in these polyphonic compositions. With the rhythmic modes, the value of each note is not determined by the form of the written note, as is the case with more recent European musical notation, but rather by the position within a group of notes written as a single figure called a ligature, and by the position of the ligature relative to other ligatures. It was a rhythmic notation that required context to decipher which mode you were using, so it still required the singers to be familiar with the work being performed. The new mensural or measured system was developed in France with the stylistic movement of the Ars Nova in the 14th century. The decisive innovation of mensural notation was the systematic use of different note shapes to denote rhythmic durations that stood in for well-defined hierarchical numerical relations to one another. While less context-dependent than notation in rhythmic modes, mensural notation differed from the modern system in that the values of the notes were still somewhat context-dependent. In particular, a note could have the length of either 2 or 3 units of the next smaller order, whereas in modern notation, these relations are invariably binary. Whether a note was to be read as ternary or perfect, or binary imperfect, was a matter partly of context rules and partly of a system of mensuration signs comparable to modern time signatures. The system of note types in mensural notation closely corresponds to the modern system. The mensural brevis is nominally the ancestor of the modern double whole note, or breve. Likewise, the semibrevis corresponds to the whole note, the semibreve, the minima to the half note, minimum, and the semi-minima to the quarter note, the crochet, and the fusa to the eighth note, or the quaver. Very rarely, mensural notation also used yet smaller subdivisions, such as the semifusa corresponding to the 16th note or the semiquaver. On the other hand, there were also 2 larger values, the longa or the quadruple whole note or long, and the maxima or the duplex longa, called large in Britain, which are no longer in regular use today. Originally, all notes were written in solid filled-in form, black notation. In the mid-15th century, scribes began to use hollow note shapes or white notation, reserving black shapes only for the smallest note values. This change was probably motivated by the change from parchment to paper as the most common writing material, as paper was less suited to holding large dots of ink. As it was evolving alongside Chant, this mensural notation system used the same system of staff lines to represent relative pitch placement. Sometimes it used 4 lines, but it could use up to 6 staff lines in certain compositions to avoid ledger lines or added lines above and below the staff for singular notes. In the early 1600s, or the early Baroque period, most of the conventions we use today had been solidified and codified into the modern system. The square shape of notes began to fall out of favor as it was faster and easier to write music using circular notes by hand. The system of the 1600s is a system we used in all of the common time periods of music until modern day. The music of the contemporary period had a few innovations that required new notation. Both serialism, the controlling of every facet of music by using a mathematical calculation, and indeterminacy, the freeing of musical actions from the determinism of time, stretched the modern notation system to the breaking point. Serialism requires so much detail in a score that it is hard to read with any fluency. Indeterminacy is hard to notate using traditional staff, so composers usually substitute graphic notation instead. Our standard method of notating music is constantly evolving and changing to fit the music of the moment. There are many other styles of notation for music, such as chordal, which is just a string of chords spelled out, or tablature, which is used by guitar and its family of instruments. Also, other parts of the world evolved their own ways of notating music through the ages. We only focused on the Western tradition today. Thanks for coming on this journey through the evolution of musical notation with me. I had a lot of fun putting this episode together. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss an upload from me. My bibliography for this episode is on my website, dominiqueroyam.com. You can help support the creation of these videos on Patreon. The link is in the description below. Follow me on social media to continue the conversation. My handle is Dominique Royam everywhere. Thanks a lot, and see you in my next video. Cat, you can't play with that cord.
I can put him out. You're very adorable. But no.
Okay.
Yeah. From the top?
From the top. Oh,